Thank you. We're going to get stuck into it straight away because of the shortage of time. 20 minutes on a topic like this is hardly anything. But so let's get started. The Nizam is dead. He passed away on 14th Jan in his apartment in Istanbul. The descendant of the last Ottoman Sultan and Caliph was also the Nizam of Hyderabad, the largest and the most wealthiest princely state in India. John, tell me about your first encounter with Mukarram Jah.
Thank you very much. This session was going to be about writing about the royal courts, but because of the death of Mukarram Jah and the fact that there are 562 royal courts, which would take a very long time to cover, but we thought because of the importance of this event and the importance of Hyderabad as a state, I mean really as the preeminent royal court in India, we thought we would mostly concentrate on that, though we'll try and get something on Jaipur in at the end, an interesting link between the two royal houses. To talk about my encounter with Jah would take probably 20 minutes just to explain how I eventually got to meet him, because he was, when I met him in southern Turkey in Antalya, he was an extremely media-shy man living an almost hermit existence in a two-bedroom flat overlooking the Mediterranean. Now, this man had been proclaimed the 8th Nizam of Hyderabad in 1967. He had inherited what was probably the largest fortune in the world. His maternal grandfather was the last Caliph and Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Yet, when I met him, he was living, as I said, in this small two-bedroom flat. The nameplate merely said Mr. Jah in a Turkish transliteration, and I doubt that any of his neighbors would have known who their illustrious neighbor was. For me, it was a mission to try and get to him, because it was an extraordinary story, a story that spanned 3 continents, England and Europe, where he was born and educated, Australia, where he lived, we'll get to that later, and of course India and Hyderabad. I found him to be a humble man, an extremely cultured man, and above all, someone who really wanted to share his story, something that he'd been prevented from doing by his minders. I think I was the first journalist stroke writer to interview him in about 20 years, and certainly the last. It was an extraordinary time. We had 4 days together. Most of that time was in the presence of his minder, his private secretary. And at first he was a bit guarded, but as the ice melted, we shared a lot, and he shared a lot of extremely personal details about his life, which was really quite tragic in many ways.
Thank you, John. Of course, we'll come to your more intimate encounters with him as you were writing the book and how he opened up. But just for all of us here, let's pull back a little bit and give us a scale of Hyderabad. Give us this. It was the largest Indian princely state. Tell us about the dominions, the administrative systems. How did Hyderabad happen? And tell us a little bit about this massive landmass called princely state of Hyderabad.
Yeah, the princely state of Hyderabad. Well, I don't need to tell the Indian members of the audience really much about it, because I'm sure they all know. But founded in 1724 by Nizam al-Mulk, rose in the detritus of the Mughal Empire, situated on some of the largest, what were at the time the richest diamond deposits in the world. So the world's largest diamonds were coming from the mines of Golconda, including the Koh-i-Noor. Of course, conquest, plunder made it the richest state. It was said that the Nizams of Hyderabad had more jewelry than all the other princely states put together. Wow. And it was strategically very important for the British, for the East India Company, and a succession of Nizams. Mukarram Jah's grandfather was Osman Ali Khan. famously known as the richest man in the world. That was the headline in a Time magazine cover from 1933, said to have been richer than the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the Fords combined, and probably was. But at the same time, this incredibly frugal figure, famously wearing the same dandruff-encrusted fez for decades, and bathing in his clothes to save on laundry bills. But he was also a very cultured man. He would, he loved sitting in his palace, composing ghazals, but he was also, an enlightened ruler. I mean, I know that Jah, when his grandfather died, wrote a very angry letter to the Times of India Times of London, because they had portrayed his father as this shuffling anachronite, sort of, shuffling around these cobweb palaces. But in fact, he was, he did a lot for Hyderabad state. Under him, you had Osmania University established. You had wonderful architecture, the High Court, the hospital. You had roads paved, education made compulsory.
This was his grandfather, right?
This was his grandfather, yeah.
So that brings me to the question, actually two questions. Why does his grandfather appoint him as successor? And if you could tell us a little bit about that. And also touch a bit about the court. You've got this fantastic nobility, the Paigas and the Jungs, who also have this brilliant culture that they bring to the court of Nizam. If you want to...
Okay, we need to go back a little bit, explain the connection between the Ottomans and the Asaf Jahi dynasty of Hyderabad. So when Abdul Majid II was sent into exile by Ataturk, the family were living in Switzerland at first, and then moved to France, to Nice, on the Riviera. And the Nizam took pity on them. He helped them out. They were, unlike the Tsars of Russia who fled with all their jewelry concealed in their garments and all that. They left with very little. I'm sure they weren't that poor, but anyway, they were pretty down on their luck compared with the opulence that they lived in Turkey. So he looked after them, and then when it was a Muslim leader at the time, Shaukat Ali, said you should think about creating an alliance between the Ottomans and the Asaf Jahis. Marry your son and your two sons to the daughter and her niece, and you will bring these two great houses of Islam together. And then the male offspring of this union between your eldest son and Abdul Majid's only daughter would be considered the next caliph. So for Osman Ali Khan, this was going to be a marriage made in heaven. The King Faisal of Iraq and Shah Reza Shah of Iran also wanted their families to marry into the Ottoman sultans, and then but in the end, Azam, the Nizam's son, and Durasheva, the only daughter of Abdul Majid, were married in Nice in 1931. Now, Durasheva was an extraordinary woman. She was described at the time as the epitome of beauty. She was fluent in several languages. She was a pianist. She was a poet. She was extremely cosmopolitan. Azam was a drunken debauchee, who spent all his money, whittled away all his money on gambling and, polo and things like that. So that was one reason why he was overlooked for the inheritance and for becoming the next Nizam. But Hyderabad, as to go into your second question, yes, it was an extremely sophisticated court. It was a center of Muslim learning. It was very traditional. You had the Paigas, which were like the royal cavalry. You had the Jungs, this nobility. Even when I went there to do my research, it was still, the manners, it was all there. Yeah.
And so let's take a little, step forward. He is coronated in 1967. It's a massive affair. This is Mukarram Jah that we're talking about. And, you know, he's actually put on the gaddi and the throne, and he's been hailed as the next Nizam. But that is very, not necessarily quickly, but that's followed by, you know, disastrous marriages, affairs, and almost a kind of detachment from India, where he flings himself into Australia. Can you talk us through that coronation and then suddenly this detachment and flee, or if you wish, to Australia? Okay. How does that happen?
Well, for a start, he'd spent very little time in Hyderabad, probably more time listening to jazz in the nightclubs of London than in the in the Durbar halls of the Chao Mahala Palace. He'd born in Nice, spent some time in Hyderabad being educated in the Palace School, then went to Harrow, Cambridge, Sandhurst. It was a pretty typical run for India's royalty at the time, and had spent very little time. So you know, suddenly he gets a phone call saying that his grandfather's dying. You've got to come back to Hyderabad, and then, you know, next thing he's being proclaimed the 8th Nizam. Now, he told me that he didn't know the difference between a diamond and a piece of glass, yet he has just inherited, you know, a fortune which is mostly made up of jewelry, the movable properties, jewels, antiques, you know, and palaces and all of this sort of stuff. So you know, I asked him, you know, there's a video you can download which was taken of the coronation, and I asked him, what were you thinking at the time? You're standing on the steps of the Chao Mahala Palace. It was the photograph from the old edition of my book. What were you thinking at the time? He said, I was thinking why my Oldsmobile that was meant to whisk me and my Turkish wife, Princess Ezra, away, was refusing to start.
So there's a sense of almost detachment in his head from reality, what he's been
He said, oh, somebody pulled out a file saying, you know, you're going to be the next Nizam, but I had nothing to rule over. Yeah. And then, of course, you know, his father had been overlooked for the succession, hadn't inherited a single, you know, rupee, let alone diamond. He had rapacious relatives who were all trying to get their hands on a bit of the inheritance. He had the Indian tax authorities, of course, breathing down his neck, and the abolition of the privy purses and privileges at the end of 71. So anyway, to cut a long story short, he cannot stand the obsequiousness of the royal court of Hyderabad, which is pretty medieval, and decides that he's going to buy a farm in Australia. He buys a 500,000 acre sheep station in one of the most remote parts of Western Australia. Now, I've got 300 acres in reasonably good land, and that's enough to keep me on the verge of, you know, I'm always on the verge of bankruptcy trying to look after it. He had 500,000 acres with no experience whatsoever in managing something like that, but he loved tinkering with heavy machineries. You know, he was obsessed, hence the why wasn't my Oldsmobile starting? And he bought himself the biggest bulldozer that money could buy, an amphibious tank that he found in some scrapyard, an ex-minesweeper that had seen service in the Korean War. And these were his playthings, and he loved being in the bush, barbed wire and blowflies and dust, because he could be himself, plain Mr. Jah, or the Shah, as he was called by people.
Is that right? He was called the Shah.
The Shah, yeah.
Because they couldn't pronounce Jah.
Yeah, they couldn't pronounce Jah. They thought, royalty, Shah. This
bit of an elevated position, right?
Yeah, these are
Jah to Shah.
You talk to the guys who knew him as I went there, and the Shah. You have a beer with one of the guys, and they'll talk about him there in very nice terms.
And very briefly, before we move into comparisons with what's happening currently with his legacy, but there's a sense of despair. He plunges into this sense of despair and acute depression because of the fear of AIDS. Tell us about that.
Yeah, look, his Turkish wife, after she took one look at this property, and she was an aristocratic Turkish lady, from a very well-to-do family. She wasn't going to put up with, being on this remote property out in the middle of nowhere. So they divorced.
At this time, he's married to Princess Ezra.
He's married to Princess Ezra, yeah. So he, it was after a few years, I think it was about 78, 79, a friend of his who's a shonky property developer, the Western Australia was the real Wild West in those days, arranges a blind date and brings his secretary along, a woman called Helen Simmons. So it's love at first sight. She changes her name to Aisha, converts to Islam, and they're happy for a few years, but again, he'd be a very difficult character to live with, especially the clash of cultures, if nothing else. So they separate, and she starts to have an affair with her driver. She has a red Triumph that she drives around Perth with, and this driver drives around. And then she has also an affair with the driver's lover. Now they're gay, and this is in '86 when AIDS has just started wreaking its havoc through the gay community. Her and Jar have separated, and one day she comes to him in tears and says she has AIDS. He's never heard of it. He just says, "Oh, that's some sort of woman's disease. You'll be all right." It's a terribly, terribly sad story. Yes, so she dies. It's the news is splashed all over the gossip columns of the West Australian newspaper. He goes to Europe, to Switzerland, has numerous tests. He's okay, but his life is never the same again. And at this point, also his finances are in complete disarray. So, having inherited the largest fortune in the world, one of the largest in '67, by this is 86, 87, or 87, 88. He can't even afford to get his yacht, his minesweeper turned yacht, fixed up in the local shipyards. So he's.
And I just want to, staying with our, the title of this conversation, Writing the Courts of India. So as he sees his fortunes dwindle, is he suspecting his courtiers who have turned on him, who've kind of, pillaged his inheritance? Do they, bear his wrath, or what happens?
Not really. No. He has no sense. He can't understand finance, can't understand money, can't understand anything. No, he has left his affairs in the hands of people who he thought he could trust, but in fact they're mismanaging his assets. They're selling off.
And they were part of his court.
They were part of his court. He always lived an extremely sheltered life. Look, at one point he gave power of attorney to a taxi driver that he met in Perth, who was an Anglo-Indian.
Gosh.
Yeah. So
there is a bit of a complete disconnect between reality and the mental space that he's inhabiting.
Yeah.
John, I want to lead into a question because we're in Jaipur. There is a kind of connection between these two royal houses, the Nizam house in Hyderabad, and then you've got Jaipur, which is also a very opulent court, renowned family. Tell us a little bit about this connection.
Okay, this is sort of segue into my book, The House of Jaipur. Everyone knows about Gayatri Devi, of course. Her mother, Indira Devi, was from the royal family of Kuch Behar. And she, in the 1920s, met, her husband had died, and she met she appointed to her state, she was the regent of Kuch Behar after her husband died, appointed a nobleman called Khusro Jung, and they became lovers.
He was devastatingly handsome.
Devastatingly handsome, yes. As they all are, as all these royals are, including you, Omar. Anyway, but so they had an affair, and there was a child out of that union called Kamala, or Baby. Now, the fact that Gayatri Devi had a half-sister was never acknowledged by the Jaipur royal family. But it was, everybody knew about it, everybody spoke about it, but no one dared to acknowledge it. So I met Khusro Jung's son in Hyderabad. I got him on the record talking about it. I also spoke to members of the royal family here who would not go on the record but also confirmed it. So there is that interesting connection between Hyderabad and Khusro Jung went on to work for Hari Singh, the Maharaja of Kashmir, and yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, audience, for being here. We can open it up for questions.
Two quick questions. Sorry,
sorry.
But I'm happy to. I'll be hanging around. Anybody wants to ask me questions?
If there are any questions, John is happy to answer them.
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm from Hyderabad, so your book has been extensively quoted in the past couple of years. I wanted to ask you what really explains the intrigue of Bukram Jah, because he was barely seen in Hyderabad for the past 3 decades, and there was this such outpouring of grief. So how do you really reconcile these facts?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, he didn't spend very much time. He was actually even he didn't at times he didn't even want to go to Hyderabad. He thought that he would be arrested because of not having paid taxes and all of that. I think the last time he was there in 2012. I think it's because his this incredible lineage that he came from. I mean, his grandfather was the last caliph of Islam, and he could have taken on that mantle had he wanted. He could have been. I mean, Nehru wooed him. He briefly served as ADC to Jawaharlal Nehru, and he could have. He probably could have ended up as the president of India if he'd wanted to. He could have he could have chosen any diplomatic mission in the world, and he would have been sent there by Nehru. I can only explain it by that. I mean, I think people still revere his grandfather, Osman Ali Khan. He was his heir and carried this religious legacy as well.
That's it.
That is it.
Maybe one more question.
One more quick question. Okay.
All right. Okay. John is going to be signing his books, so please feel free to. Okay. Sorry. One quick question.
Yes, Princess Ezra. Yes, which is terrific. Yeah. So Princess Ezra, his first wife, she's been fundamental in restoring the Falaknuma Palace and the Char Mahalla Palace, and I hope there's other palaces there which also come under her purview. And she has really worked incredibly hard to I guess restore some of the neglect that was caused by the fact that he left Hyderabad and he left his affairs behind. So she's done stellar work. So that is a good thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for coming. Thank you.